financing of cities. First is how should cities access this finance, and how do we create an enabling environment that can support this or facilitate this? Second is the dimension of institutions aiding cities to access this. Third is the role of global banks and funding mechanisms. And finally, to answer where the opportunities lie, we will discuss this topic, accelerating climate finance from a city's lens. Today morning, we have with us this amazing panel. Let me introduce you to them. Mr. Aditya Ramji, Director, India ZEV Research Center, UC Davis. Ms. Divya Sharma, Executive Director, Climate Group. Mr. Hubert Jenny, former Senior Infrastructure Specialist with the Green Climate Fund. And Mr. Subhashish Dey, Director, Climate Policy and Climate Finance, Shakti Sustainable. Welcome all of you. And I'm your moderator, Saili Udas Mankikar from NIUA. Just to go through today's format, we will have 2 rounds of questions from my end to each of the panelists, post which we will open this for 1 round of questions to the panelists from the audience. I would like to dedicate the first round of this discussion to understanding the vivid dimensions of this question. So let me first begin my question to this round to Ms. Divya Sharma. So Ms. Sharma, when we talk about climate finance, we are talking about cities here, and we see cities grappling with the basics. So questions like, how do they identify such finance? How do they create proposals? How do they de-risk? How do they pitch? There is a dearth of understanding and capacities to attract and implement such projects in cities here. How do we fix this? Over to you, Divya.
Thank you, Siali, and thank you very much for having me here today. It's a very important question, and I'm glad that you asked it upfront as we start this event and workshop. So yes, it's true. Often in my own experience of working with cities, the demand has been to build capacities. 1, to plan for resilience, and 2, to develop bankable adaptation projects that are embedded in overall infrastructure planning for growing cities. And investment in urban infrastructure for developing countries tends to be funded by public sector, but the sheer scale of the required investment necessitates the unlocking of private sources of financing. A lot of funds in terms of loans and sometimes in terms of grants have been pulled in by the likes of Asian Development Bank, World Bank, JICA, and so on. But what we have found cities grapple with is the fact that some of these infrastructure are 1, resilient to extreme events, and 2, are built in a way that they do not counter the environmental benefits or the social benefits that actually should be coming any infrastructure that is being built in the cities. When we look at adaptation, I think in the past, in my experience, we have looked at some great initiatives, such as the one I would mention here would be CDIA, which is City Development Initiative of Asia, which had a toolkit that was used to build the capacity of cities around climate-sensitive infrastructure planning. That kind of capacity building is needed, is the need of the hour. And the reach of that particular program was limited to Asian cities, and some of the Indian cities also benefited. Rajkot was one of them. But I think the basic model of how some of these cities can plan climate infrastructure that is climate resilient and adaptation projects was really noteworthy. In my experience, the Asia Pacific Network Program was also helping build capacities of cities across the board when it came to climate resilience and understanding how can the cities unlock some of the potential, whether it is budgeting process, whether it is policy process, whether it is development regulations, to help cities think about adaptation and mitigation as something not that has come up as a different layer of what they are already doing, but integrate between the work that they do day in and day out within the city framework. And when I talk about it, the institutions that are doing this involve municipal corporation. They involve the development authorities that are looking at master planning and land use planning. It also involves the parastatals that hold their own budget and can look at some of these sector specific demands. So as I said, context specific instruments, multiple one, should be looked at and deployed. I was looking at one of the study by the IFC, and it suggested that cities should strengthen their municipal finance capacities, including budgeting, financial management, contract management, and procurement, to improve the overall quality of service provision and investments. And this can also lay a stronger foundation for climate finance through the improved use of physical transfers, own source revenues, and blended finance instruments. And where should one invest lastly? So answer definitely comes as, where should one invest? So the investment is needed both in technologies for resilient infrastructure and therefore capacities around it, but also nature-based solutions that provide environmental and social co-benefits. And these are traditional knowledge that already exist within the cities, which we have been ignoring since very long. And I think it's a high time, when we are talking about dearth of climate finance, we start looking at some of these nature-based solutions that are not as expensive, but are long-term solutions, provide long-term solutions to some of the problems that climate change is posing to cities. And one last point that I want to add here is that climate consideration will have to be made at all four levels of city planning: strategic planning, spatial planning, capital investment, as well as budgetary allocation. I hope it answers your
Yeah.
question.
Thank you, Divya. I think you really laid down, I think, a good pathway for the discussion ahead, because here is where I would like to bring Mr. Aditya Ramji in. Since we are looking at the domestic dimension, if I may call it that, and Divya has already mentioned about the role of other agencies, whether it's parastatals that she mentions about municipal corporations and finance as such. But if we really zoom out, the role of a state here becomes very, very important. And because if you look at climate, that is where the climate plans, the state climate plans are being formulated, and it's all trickling down. So can you help us by for an understanding on this dimension, Aditya?
Sure. Thanks, Ali, and thanks for having me on this panel. It's there's no doubt that subnational governments, whether it's state or cities, will be critical. And I would say critical in operationalizing climate action. Right? We can make all these national plans or very broad, overarching plans. At the end of the day, they are, even in India, constitutionally and just by their roles, they are the agencies closest to delivering citizen services in the reliable, sustainable manner that we all want. And anywhere from transport, healthcare, energy, all of that. And one of the first things I think, in terms of, I think Divya talked about capacity building, and there's no doubt that that's required. What we've done maybe in the last decade and a half with national level capacity building on climate action is probably what we need to be doing now with state and city level actors, right? We haven't necessarily taken that same momentum the way various institutions work with the national government to actually translate that. What does that mean for city level actors? What does that mean for state level actors, right? What does a net zero target mean? What does aligning to Paris Agreement mean? I mean, we've over the years, all of us here on this panel are practitioners in different ways, and we've dealt with many of these stakeholders over the years. And we've always complained, right, that these are gaps. But I think being able to, one aspect, yes, to be able to create toolkits, etc., true. But just the first step of being able to translate some of these targets, I think is number one. to, these things, these transition pathways will mean different things. It'll mean a different thing for a state like Maharashtra. It'll mean something different for Uttar Pradesh. Even within these states, it'll mean different things for different cities of different kinds. So you can have a city as big as Mumbai having to deal with a very different set of climate transition problems, or urban, transition problems, versus, let's say, a city like Nagpur that may have a very different set of orientations and things that might want to do, and may not even want. And some of these other growing cities, tier 2, tier 3 cities, have the opportunity today to kind of, not necessarily repeat the kind of urban growth that we may or may not want that other major cities have done, right? So it presents us a good opportunity to kind of be able to do this. If you actually look back, back in 2010, when India began with the National Action Plan on Climate Change and all of those efforts, we did have something called the State Action Plan on Climate Change that was being asked of all the states back then to create. And many of them did that between 2011 and 14. I don't think we've really followed up on that. I mean, what were they created on? What were the foundations on which they were created? A lot of those goalposts are probably dynamic and have changed, but I think just being able to maybe take a step back and think about how we went about some of those exercises might be useful lessons on what we need to do now and where we want to potentially course correct, right? I mean, ideally, the way I would look at it is this, right? Have a scoping plan at the state level. And then city plans need to potentially align to those broad goals of the state scoping plan. But then, and then be able to have certain context specific, regulations or policies or whatever. And then this will require some iterative processes. I don't think we necessarily see this kind of a structure of planning that happens. Let me give you a class example. I spent some time in the energy space, and then now been more on the transport side of the last 8 or 9 years. But we talk about state EV policies in India. Almost every state now has a state EV policy. But is that equal to a state transport policy? No. We think EVs is equal to transportation, and that's not true. That's the way the narrative has emerged so far. But imagine this: if we actually create a sound transport planning or transport policy that looks at not just road transport, but being able to look at rail, look at some of the modal shifts, look at different things and what is the end goal that you want to achieve, and then be able to fit electrification within that, would probably be a much more efficient way of figuring out what infrastructure you need to set out, how much money you need to set out for that kind of a transition and things like that, right? I mean, this is just one example, and there'll probably be numerous other examples that my fellow panelists can give, but I think these are probably, just some ways in which, the importance of how we look at subnational actors and the role they would play in being able to leverage, climate finance for cities and urban development would be critical. The last couple of things I'll say is, last year, for example, the union budget talked about setting out low emissions zones. What that means and what that has, there hasn't been much progress as far as I'm aware of, since in the last 12 months on aspects like that. This year, less than a few weeks ago, the union finance minister in the latest budget speech made various suggestions on setting up an urban infrastructure development fund for cities, and the need and the support that the infrastructure finance sector would provide for states and cities to actually be able to leverage capital for similar for infrastructure projects, etc. So but the process in which these would happen should be able to account for a lot of things that Divya talked about, and some of the things that I mentioned, to be able to make these dollars or these rupees in terms of outcomes far more efficient, right? And then the last thing I'll just say is this, right? When just at the risk of being chastised, but I think the role and the weight on shoulders of institutions like NIUA or Climate Group or Shakti or or anybody else that they have played in setting national climate agenda, I guess the weight is even more higher for agencies like ours or institutions like ours to be able to actually take this a notch down. And I think actually there'll be far greater value in the role that institutions like ours could potentially play in kind of driving some of these subnational actors to be able to set the right frameworks. And you rightly said, they may not necessarily have the time and the bandwidth and the capacity to be able to deliver a lot of this planning and this exercise. And I think that would be just another thought for me, just in terms of how all of us here can play a potential role. Let me just stop there. Thank you.
Thank you, Aditya. And in fact, you really helped me, because that's exactly my next question. That the role of institutions as such, but specifically, I would like to come to Mr. Shubhashish Day here, and talking about the next dimension really, which in a way Aditya brought in, was on the finance part. And Shakti has been working, of course, towards building this the whole narrative for the country, but also on the important dimension of investment, which is philanthropic capital, that keeps coming up all the time. We garner cumulative philanthropic capital towards climate finance and climate action to accelerate low carbon transitions. Can you help us understand this dimension?
Thank you, Shali. And first of all, I would like to thank NIUA for organizing this important workshop or seminar and inviting me here. In terms of philanthropic capital, unfortunate reality is that the financial capital flow in climate action in India is minuscule. It will be of the tune of, say, $70 to $100 million per annum, which is very limited. Now, what this minuscule and a part of that would go into supporting climate finance, maybe 10 to 15% of that at this point of time. So there is a lot of avenues available for leveraging financial or rather philanthropic capital in climate-related activities. But coming back to your question, normally the philanthropic capital goes into evidence generation, most of it at this point of time. But there is a lot of opportunity where financial capital also can work as a catalytical investment opportunity. Just to give you an example, so there are a lot of investment, and many of them are related to cities, which are perceived as high risk investment, be it the financial health of the municipal organization, or because the technology is not adopted at scale in India. So for those reasons, the investment often is considered high risk by the financial institutions. So there often catalytic investment or risk mitigation investment can come from philanthropic organization. That has happened in various other countries at a very limited scale in India at this point of time. But those are areas in which philanthropic capital can bring in value. As far as the evidence creation is concerned, most of, again, has gone into greening of finance, where there are a portfolio of green projects available, where financial institution, philanthropic institution might have helped them raise finance. But a lot of effort has to go into greening of finance. And what I mean by greening of finance is the understanding of the financial sector of what is green. So currently the way the financial risk mitigation or the portfolio level assessment which a financial institution does in India, be it the regulated entities or the NBFCs, they don't consider climate risk or climate or green finance as a parameter for evaluation. So those are areas, again, if you can make a dent, inform the real critical stakeholders, be at the central or the state level, that can make a lot of difference in terms of making those flow coming to areas where money is required at this point of time at scale. So I'll pause here and over to you, Shali.
Thank you, Mr. Shubhashish. I think you really pointed out very, very important parts, which I will take up in the second round, actually, of evidence generation and the need to really for the financial sector to really understand climate in the right way, to kind of put in the money there, and to avoid greenwashing also. So I think there are several dimensions that you brought out through your discussion, which also takes me to the next person who we are hoping can give us a global dimension to this discussion, Mr. Hubert Jenny. It's well known that cities have scarce public resources, and we have a very we have targets that are thrown at us all the time, whether it's dates or net zero, etc. which means that we have a very short window to realize this. So how do you, please help us understand, how does one use the existing global resources to mobilize larger financial flows from the public and private sectors and also balance debt while this is happening? And I would like you to reflect from your experience with the Green Climate Fund on this. Thank you.
Thank you very much, first for inviting me, and my apologies for logging in late. I don't know if I confused the time zone or the starting
No
time.
problem. No problem.
Yeah,
Please.
thank you very much. So first, I want to split. We're talking about urban, and urban is, as per the Green Climate Fund and most climate fund, categorized under climate change mitigation, which means that we're looking at the name of the game is how to reduce greenhouse gas emission from cities. And the Green Climate Fund has 3 paradigm shifting pathway. They have published about 18 months ago, urban sector guide. So basically, what can we do at the city level to scale up distributed renewable energy using smart grid system, and where the household and the building, private or public building, are at certain time of the day net producer, other time of the day net consumer. And you can have a self-sustained system through this distributed power arrangement using a smart grid. The second is energy efficiency building. This is a very low hanging fruit, and I see as a massive program USAID as well on retrofitting existing building and make sure that new building being constructed are green building, where we maximize energy efficiency. And maybe not for India, but for some countries also linked to the safety, minimize fire hazard, because some of those insulating material, if you don't have a good regulation and proper enforcement, you are basically generating fire hazard. And I'm thinking, with due respect, of China, where I spent 5 years. The last one is basically compact and resilient urban development, where transit-oriented development is also low-hanging fruit. How do we bring people from A to B, including last mile? I think, even cities with extensive public transport system have a problem with last mile, especially vulnerable people, like people with disabilities, women and girls, and combine with a lot of things. So this is the mitigation part, and then I will talk about the adaptation part in the second part of my discussion. But basically, the name of the game is, what can we do to incite private, institutional, and commercial financing? Because there is just not enough public funding to finance the infrastructure requirement. And this is true for any country, developed country, developing country, middle-income country, least developed country. What can we do to leverage those public resource, like you mentioned, scarce public resource? So what can we do to attract private sector? What can we do to attract institutional and commercial finance? The next thing to realize is urban services, including basic urban services, is not free. Somebody is paying for it, whether it comes from the fiscal budget at the central or local government level in terms of subsidies for capital investment, or shadow tariff for operation and maintenance, or budget support through various forms, to the company that, or the service, public service or private service that operate these urban services. User pay is the best practice. And what I found during I spent 20 years in development before joining the Green Climate Fund, is that actually vulnerable people and poor people can pay for the service. And for example, if I take water, the alternative cost of getting water from a non-pipe system is much more expensive. The problem is the barrier to access the service. If I remain on my example of water, the cost of the meter. If you ask a household to buy the meter, they don't have the money to do that, but they have money to pay for the operation and maintenance costs. So in some countries like Vietnam, China, the meter is owned by the water company, so that they install the meter, they can change it when they feel the meter is not working properly, and they can do calibration, they can do maintenance of the meter. And we found that vulnerable people, poor people, can usually pay for this service. So I don't want to talk too long. I'm going to stop here and leave some time for question after. But in conclusion, name of the game is what can we do to leverage public funding and attract private, institutional, and commercial finance? Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Hubert. And now this takes me to my second round, and I'm going to pick up on some things. I think one is, Hubert, you laid down some low-hanging fruits on mitigation, really, in your thing, but you also came down to talk about how urban services are not free, but also putting in a social highlighting the social and economic dimension of things together. Divya also in her opening remarks really brought out the social dimension of things, but also pointed out to, how the answers lie in things like NBS, tech, which is resilient. So I think the whole resilient part of things was highlighted by her already. So Divya, since Hubert really picked up more on the mitigation part, and if we talk of NBS, we are looking at many solutions being, tilting towards adaptation, really. So if we are talking of adaptation funding, it really seems like a challenge. In fact, if we look at the time post-COVID, a lot of investment has really moved to healthcare, economic relief, which really leaves very scarce resources for investment in resilience, in climate resilience as such. So what are the ways to spur greater investment in climate adaptation? Your views on this?
Yeah, thank you. So as I said, this was
Hubert, sorry, this question was for Divya. Sorry.
No worries. I'll get back later.
Yes, I'll come back to you after in the second round. Thank you.
Thank you, Sally. Yes, I think you are right. There has been vastly insufficient levels of urban climate finance. In the past year, if you look at some of the figures, you will see that in the development economies, particularly South Asia and Sub-Saharan Africa, it's really low. And they are, in fact, highly concentrated in OECD countries and China. And many developing countries, besides China, they saw many minor volumes of climate investment despite their rapidly growing urban centers. We also see that there are wide differences in enabling environment within countries and across the world when it comes to adaptation funding. So many cities and worldwide also, cities have demonstrated innovation in climate action planning and city resilience strategy planning. However, what we have seen is matching funding to support this multi-dimensional, multi-sectoral city resilience plan has not taken off. It has been really missing. Now, one argument with some element of truth could be that the adaptation and resilient budget should be embedded in the sectoral dimensions of city planning. For example, waste management, for example, the flood resilient road design or neighborhood planning, or upgrading regular stormwater management practices by channelizing funds to enhance the carrying capacity of urban stormwater drainage, for example. But let's agree, while I said that, let's agree that there is one whole set of work that would need funding at a sectoral level, but also a wider, more broad approach to adaptive cities will lead us to think about funding large infrastructure while also reinventing master planning process and risk-sensitive land use change. So planning here is the easier part. Implementation and of development regulations and bringing in adaptive and resilient solutions to urban infrastructure, that is a bigger problem. And that would need dedicated investments. So a few years back, Asian Development Bank had instituted a trust fund, which was called Urban Climate Change Resilience Trust Fund, where Rockefeller Foundation, KfW, the then DFID, which is now FCDO, ADB itself, and a few others had, kind of pooled in funds to make sure that whatever urban infrastructure is taking place, this particular trust fund would enable that infrastructure to be one, green, and two, resilient. And at a city level, this particular type of model was instituted in Surat. They had also instituted a resilience trust fund. Now, this is something for cities to look at, whether this is something that is doable and made, kind of institutionalized or mainstream. Then the other problem of making cities investment worthy comes into picture to catch private funds. So PPP models have not really worked traditionally in the urban space. Two big reasons: one, shortcoming of contracting, and two, creditworthiness of cities. And Subhashish was also speaking about this previously. Now, debt financing instruments such as green bonds have great potential. They have great potential to drive climate smart investment by allowing cities to acquire long-term debt, that too at stable prices. And bigger cities having a larger pocket have tried instruments like green bonds. But adaptation needs of secondary and tertiary cities are far more pronounced, given their already weak revenue base. So that is where the capacity, that is where the private investment should be going. And there have to be some innovative ways that needs to be, kind of built between private and, public sector together, that can look at some of that adaptation needs also. And when we come to, designing climate smart urban infrastructure projects, it should be prepared with attention to potential revenue generation opportunities, maybe with private sector engagement at early stage only. Now, at Climate Group, we have been working with businesses and large corporates, and our experience shows that these businesses and corporates are themselves taking several ambitious targets and are willing to support governments in various ways. These models of investment need innovation and out-of-box thinking to bring investment to cities towards climate adaptation. I'll give you again the example of Surat. The time when the Surat had started with preparing their climate smart resilience and climate resilience strategies, a big part of the job and a big responsibility that was taken in for the success of this program was South Gujarat Chamber of Commerce. The industries had come in, had joined hand with the municipal corporation, with the state machinery, to make sure that some of these efforts that are being, created by Rockefeller Foundation and other partners, kind of bear fruits, and it is taken forward. And last point would be that targeted taxes and incentives, these are also to be used to encourage investment in such infrastructure. This should also favor, and Hubert was making this point, and I would really like to say that it is one of the important points that we should consider, is that some of this investment should not take us away from, the sustainable practices, but it should rather favor density over urban sprawl or low carbon energy over fossil fuel sources. Land value capture mechanism, they can encourage green infrastructure development while also leveraging private finance. So I think with support from national as well as international partners, cities can develop, they are already developing globally, dedicated vehicles to enable private green investment.
Thank you, Divya, for your intervention. And, one of the points you talked about is innovative ways of, we have to work towards that, innovative pathways towards green. But I would like to, tap Mr. Aditya Ramji and Mr. Subhashish, they're both on solutions. So first coming to Mr. Ramji, I would say, with the scattered and absence climate data, I mean, many a times when we speak to, multilaterals or even investors, we find these things coming up all the time. This kind of probably, if I may, complaints that there is not enough climate data, there is patchy climate architecture, there are unstructured disclosure standards, lack of taxonomy, so many things that keep investors from parking funds. I mean, there is no clear risk assessment. That's what we assess. So how do we fix this? What are the steps? Since, in your last conversation, you said a step back. I think, how do we help cities fix this? Over to you.
Thanks, Ali. No, that's a very good question also. And I think, maybe just, what is climate data? Its first step is data, right? Any planning, we've talked so much about planning today. Any planning exercise needs to be built on certain foundations of evidence, and you need data for that. Now, but we also need publicly available data. So very often this data does lie in formats that either are not usable or are not being collected, with the depth of information that you require. So I think, so I'll give you an example. There's actually a smart, India has the smart cities mission. We created this open data governance portal and this India Urban Data Exchange. And I've been spending some time on that over the last actually few months, trying to get some city level data on transportation. And very simple. I was trying to see, if I had to lay out, get a private investor to actually invest in a network of public charging stations for a city, how would they go about doing that? And one of the first questions was, can we get data on the number of parking lots that are there in a city? So there is the city of Amravati, incidentally, actually, so the data exchange actually gives you're able to filter data on different parameters. So I started looking for parking lot data, and the city of Amravati in Andhra Pradesh popped up, and it said there is parking lot information. So I was like, great, open that Excel sheet. It actually has just 2 cells filled out. It's supposed to tell you the lat and long, or the actual location of every parking lot in the city. All it tells you is the total number of car parking lots and 2-wheeler parking lots. Now, what could you do with information like this? I don't know the capacity of these parking lots. I don't know how big these parking lots are, how they're designed. I mean, you need a little more than that as basic information to be able to create, let's say, a charging infrastructure rollout plan. Now, so first step is, just the depth and the level of information that is to be made is very important. So just having an open data portal is probably, of no use. So maybe as a step one, setting those data benchmarks on quality of data is step one. The climate part of it is the planning that we do to meet the goals of climate resilience or mitigation or adaptation or whatever. But the data is not necessarily climate data, right? You need to have transport data. You need to have, quality of roads data, whatever else. The second thing is, I talked about capacity building, but, can we have a set of metrics for a project that actually show how it builds in the concept of, let's say, climate additionality? States and municipal corporations and city governments have their own budgets, and some of them actually have pretty large sums of money that they manage. But even within their existing plans and projects that they set out, to be able to say that, okay, every project or every investment decision is contributing to some climate goal, whether it's adaptation or mitigation, doesn't matter, but this is the way it's envisaged to contribute, in my mind, can almost create that basic fundamental to leverage, that multiplier effect of public finance that Hubert was talking about, right? That gives confidence to private capital holders that, all right, there is an effort, and here is where the gaps are that we can help fill in to be able to actually say that we can efficiently put that money behind those investment decisions. The third thing is, that leads you to be able to then create a level of taxonomy for government projects in some way. And, even applying that taxonomy, I mean, again, we have all this. Smart cities program in India asks cities to bid for various different projects. They range from, road transport to bicycling to creating to green buildings to water, all kinds of things. If the taxonomy was applied to each of these projects, the climate narrative of it, I think the impact that this program could have had could be tremendous, right? In being able to leverage that, being able to efficiently leverage, even private capital on top of that. And I think here we can learn. It's not that these things don't exist. There have been various attempts by various institutions to create something like this. The EU is a very good example. They've actually been able to take the EU-wide taxonomy framework, which they launched a couple of years ago, to member states, and then to a level below to provinces and cities. And I think there is, just since we are talking in the context of U20 and G20, maybe this opens an opportunity to also learn from fellow member countries. And that would then mean that so cities can actually set a pipeline of infrastructure projects. I would call it a city infrastructure pipeline. We used to have this national infrastructure pipeline of projects that we announced at the national. We can do the same thing for cities, and that are measured on parameters of service delivery, on costs, and the climate additionality metrics that we can set. And that would then, we talked about municipal bonds or whatever else that municipal corporations trying to do to leverage money from the market. It's fashionable now to go to the market to raise money, but if you actually had a pipeline of bankable projects already set with all these metrics, the ability of the market to give you that capital at rates that are affordable, at longer tenors, the whole ecosystem can respond very differently, in my opinion. We talk of planning. We need to have planning tools. It can be simple Excel tools to more complicated life cycle analysis tools, depending on what the context or the policy pathway requires, and some level of cost assessments, etc. We need to be able to build some of these things for cities to be able to use, to be able to, make efficient decision making. And then last thing is accountability. You can set plans, you can set all of this, but I think plans need to be followed by rulemaking. What we have is a lot of plans. What we don't have at the subnational level is rulemaking. Rulemaking means you actually mandate or ensure that these are being enforced. And then the rulemaking then needs to be followed with enforcement. So I think that we've probably done a pretty good job at step one of planning. We haven't done a very good job of rulemaking and enforcement, right? And these are two aspects that I think we need to do. We've had these issues even at the national level. I think it's the same. It's those same gaps sometimes that we need to plug those, right? And once you have that, automatically your city and state officials, become accountable for the outcomes and those actions that are set out in those plans. And then, but then, the last thing I'll say is also this, that city and state officials do need to be involved a lot more. We need to give them a far more prominent position to be able to help set the climate action narrative that we want, right? Because ultimately, I think I guess we all agree that, they are in many ways the final executing and the more probably the entities with the most responsibility to actually deliver all those goals and plans that we have, whether it's national or whatever else. So hopefully that helps answer that question on how we deal with data and taxonomy and whatever else. And then one thing I'll say, you talked about disclosure standards. Actually, the central bank in India and the Stock Exchange Board of India, both regulators actually have attempted to set disclosure standards. I think they've just, we haven't gone to the point of being able to mandate some of these frameworks, but I think their role in being able to set this would also kind of help, streamline how institutions and municipal corporations are able to leverage, market capital for all of this. And then I think National Stock Exchange, if my awareness goes right, a few days ago actually announced a municipal bonds index that they intend to have now available, which will actually help track performance of how some of these municipal bonds perform, but hedged against or benched against some of the actions that they take. So I think that will hopefully also help set some of this narrative in the right place.
Thank you, Mr. Ramji, for that. I think many suggestions there, and maybe city pipeline project. I think there is something like that which is in the pipeline. I would say that and hopefully this should be one of the solutions. So let me now come to Mr. Subhashish Dey. And Mr. Dey, two things. I think Shakti really sits at the cusp of so many things here, because a lot of money gets into energy transitions, mobility, and your institution really works in this. So one is, if you want to reflect on my previous question to Mr. Ramji on the absent climate data and the patchy climate in architecture, especially because you sit on this cusp. But also, referring to one of your, since we are talking of solutions, referring to one of your reports where you really talk about issues of standardization of climate budgets, and you also talk of a national portal on monitoring and verifying funds, which is something that came up in the previous conversation also. So over to you, Mr. D.
Thank you. First, reflecting on the requirement of data. Now, as far as investors are concerned, again, I can't call out on behalf of investors, but from the limited understanding which I have, for green investor, taxonomy becomes an important issue, taxonomy regulation and disclosure. Incidentally, this has to be developed at a national level. The cities can ask for it. Maybe a group of cities can ask for it and build that bottom-up momentum. Incidentally, in 2021, Department of Economic Affairs actually constituted a task force, multi-government task force, which also included experts, to look at climate-related disclosures and regulations, and also building of taxonomy. So the report was submitted by end of 2021, and we are not really at the know of things where that has gone into. So the first draft of taxonomy for India has been actually created, the green taxonomy so-called, has been created and lying with the Ministry of Finance as we speak. The second is in terms of data. So data, again, comes at various levels. A set of data, like I'm taking Aditya's example of the EV charging infrastructure. So if you're developing a policy, mostly data is available, maybe not in a format which is readily usable. So you might get to know that how many charging infrastructure, parking is there available. You might not get a data of how big that parking is, how you create that infrastructure using that parking, that won't be available. But for a policymaker, it might be enough to know that there is parking available and so many parking is available. So where charging infrastructure can be created. But that data might not be useful for an investor to come and invest. And that data might not be even created initially, because for every investment, you have to create an investment grade TPR. And there, again, the challenges come because often the municipal authorities don't have enough resources. I don't always say that it's financial resources, but also the resources within the government to actually draft a TOR and float it, tender it out, get the right set of institution to develop that DPR. So there is a challenge there, and that's why many of these organized, or rather municipalities, reach out to bilateral, multilateral, and philanthropic and institution, as well as climate experts, to house a PMU within the municipality who can help them out on developing those TORs. On the other question, which is on green budget, yes, we had been working on it and with partners like Terry and Adri for last couple of years. Now, when we talk about green budget of climate budget, what is happening at this point of time, that most states which has this in place, states like Bihar, and I believe Tamil Nadu is also developing some, Madhya Pradesh might have done in past. So most of them, what they do, they tag the budget with certain parameters and call these certain parameters as green and not. So there is no standardization at this point of time, and what it means that there is a chance of greenwashing. I'll just give you an example from a past experience that say the forest department has forest guards. Now, every year there is a budget allocated for forest guard. Now there was a ask that the budget allocated for forest guard should be considered as green activity. So we need to then take a call on whether to call it as a green activity, because there is no additionality there. So for that, you require some level of standardization through which that budget can be looked at. But what the more or important focus should be, that the state governments take a proactive look and make this budgetary allocation for climate proofing of infrastructure or developmental fund as a pre-activity to the budget, not something that the budget has been created and then you try to find out from the budget which activities are green, which is currently happening. So for that, again, tracking is important, and tracking and then letting people know that who are doing better job. That can be even done by someone like, say, Niti Aayog, with support from expert like many of us in the panel and outside. So those are things which are evolving, but we are not yet there as far as to understand the real benefit of creating that climate budget and green budget.
Thank you, Mr. Day. And I believe you have to leave. So, and we are going to extend this discussion for 10 minutes. So we are going to be here till 12:10. So I hope you can stay till then. If not, then let us know.
Sure.
Yeah.
I need to drop off by, say, 12:05.
Okay, let me try to pose the next question to the next panelist and see if I can bring you in with the first question that is posed by our attendees. I can try to do that. Yeah, 1 minute. Just hold. Sorry. So now just moving on to Mr. Hubert Jenny again. So Mr. Jenny, bringing you on onto your, if you want to reflect on any of the, any of the points put forth by the previous, panelists, but also, bringing you down to what you wanted to talk about, mainly the adaptation part of things, but also looking at it from the critical role of overseas development assistance, particularly for highly climate vulnerable developing countries and the financial instruments thereof. Can you just help us understand that?
Thank you very much. Yeah, as I say, urban is a mitigation result area, but a lot can be done in climate change adaptation. It's not one or the other, but I see some question from the audience that seems to confuse a little bit mitigation and adaptation. And we have basically mitigation is to reduce greenhouse gas emission. And because if the climate effect continue, we are going to have problem and we will need to adapt. And therefore, those adaptation project, that's the best way I can explain. Now, in a city context, one of the adaptation project I love are sponge city type of project for several reasons. First, you increase the green area percentage in the city. You transform some flooded area into a new land available that can be green space, that can become a commercial, can become a real estate. And one of the panelists mentioned land value capture. Basically, you can have a self-paying mechanism if you organize very well your sponge city. You protect your asset against flooding because you have integrated urban water management. And you are encouraged to bring in those nature-based solutions. There is a lot of work being done on pushing, so you can call it nature-based solution, you can call it ecosystem-based adaptation, they are the same. But basically, green infrastructure are the way to go. And I can tell you when I retired from GCF last April, we were working on what can we do to give a competitive edge to green infrastructure compared to gray infrastructure? And the best way is basically to look at the entire supply chain. So if you do gray infrastructure, you are likely to use a lot of concrete and steel. And the manufacturing of steel and concrete is basically penalizing in terms of greenhouse gas emissions. So basically, if the Green Climate Fund, with the largest climate fund, start to account for greenhouse gas emission in the supply chain, that will give a competitive edge to green infrastructure compared to gray infrastructure. So there is no question that anybody is trying to facilitate this introduction of infrastructure. Now, from an official development assistance perspective, I think the previous speaker mentioned it. the government is in the driving seat. I work for World Bank and Asian Development Bank, and it makes me smile when people think, yeah, you should do this, you should do that. I say, well, you know, I can propose to the government, but like with my wife, I propose and the government dispose. The government has priority, which might be different than our priority, and we have to respect that. You know, I don't pretend to be a specialist of India. You live in India, you know better than me the issue, but the government has been nominated or basically should be able to do those priorities. And the country programming of World Bank, ADB, and other institutions is basically to work with the government on those priorities. The Green Climate Fund doesn't have, they have a country programming, but they don't have the staffing to manage this. So they nominate what they call a nationally designated authority for the country, and usually the planning agency or the Ministry of Environment. And this NDA is doing the prioritization of climate project that will be submitted to the Green Climate Fund for funding. So I think there is a due process with the government, and I think that's the best way to do to be in the driving seat. Now, to me, the role of ODA is to do model project. We have to bring in innovation. We have to push the envelope and convince the government through champion identifying local government. Okay, do you want to try this? That's never been tried before, and you know, we want to try. And it's not that you are going to be guinea pig, but we're going to do this together. And what I say is that the project result might not be perfect, but we're giving the blueprint to the government with the lesson learned on how to do this type of project and scale them up, replicating them in the country and in the region. So to me, the role of ODA is very important in terms of bringing innovation and doing those demonstration pilot projects. Now, in order, same thing, if we want to bring in more financing, PPP is a very good leveraging tool. It leverage 1, 2, 3. So, but you need a clear contractual arrangement. You need a good national PPP framework, because private sector are not philanthropists. They want to make sure that they invest their money, they can get their money back with a profit. There is also, somebody talk about credit enhancement. You have guarantee, and you have also institution like the Green Climate Fund that can take first loss. So that means if a project goes sideways, the Green Climate Fund agree if they know in advance, and it's okay, this amount of money from the GCF will be at risk, and we are using it as first loss, and that constitute 20%. That's fine. We talk about green bond. I like to talk about fund and local development investment fund, because fund allow you to leverage much more than PPP, especially when you start working through sub-fund. They need to be properly structured. They need to be properly managed, not with a second-rate fund manager, but a top-notch fund manager, because the name of the fund manager will help raise private financing. You basically raise financing on the good name of not of the investment strategy, but of the fund manager in reality. So very good leveraging tool. I work on the Shandong Green Development Fund. That was the first Chinese project approved by the Green Climate Fund. There was $500 million of, I would say, concessional money from various ODA partner. There was 300 million from the leading city in Shandong State, and 50% were brought by private limited partners. So very good leveraging, and this one we leverage 15 times. I work on a climate facility for children in Africa with Development Bank of South Africa and UNICEF. Also very good leveraging power. And why not do a climate facility for city, for a region of India, or even a state? One state can say, okay, I want to do a climate facility statewide. and we define the modality on how this is going to work, what we're going to invest. But if the government is behind, like somebody mentioned, very important to put the government in the driving seat, we can, and the investor realize that the government is serious about it. You have the backing of ODA partner, including Green Climate Fund. I think you're in business. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Thank you so much, Mr. Huberjani. In fact, you answered one of the questions that, you read it already and answered one of the questions that our, someone attending our discussion raised on any good models practiced and examples. So thank you for that. I will now take a few. We have just about 5 minutes left. And so I'd request our panelists to quickly respond to some of these questions I'll put to them. So the first question I would like to put is to Mr. Aditya Ramji. So one of our attendees says, what is the role, if any, that carbon credits can play in this space? What should India be doing in building carbon markets?
Sure. I think there's no doubt that the carbon market can play a strong role. And I think the first thing, the first positive step we've already taken is the amendment to the Energy Conservation Act that we did in August 2022. A few months ago, where it has set the ball rolling for the Bureau of Energy Efficiency to actually design a national carbon market. Now, whether we take a sectoral approach or we take a multi-sectoral approach is something that I think the jury is out and we need to kind of figure that out. But I think we've taken the first important positive step in that direction. There is already the PAT scheme that we used to run. It's kind of a credit market that's done, that's had a good outcome in terms of at least what we wanted to achieve from an energy efficiency standpoint. So I think India has the experience to be able to replicate in scale. We could do, we're learning from California as an example, where they did the zero emission vehicle credit program. That was a similar thing, but very focused on road transport electrification. So, India has been talking a lot about being able to draw lessons from that for transportation. So I think there are already narratives happening. And I think we've taken the first set of steps necessary for that to give it legislative teeth. So hopefully, we should be able to actually see some positive outcomes in the next year and a half.
Thank you, Mr. Ramji. The second question I would like to pass on to Ms. Divya Sharma. One of our attendees says, given that climate is a cross-cutting issue across sectors, which is transport, wash, housing, how can we mitigate lack of interdepartmental communication in state cities, which should be key for implementation of these climate plans? So yes, over to you.
Sure, Sally. I think there is quite a positive change in that directions in the last few years. I would say cities do work in tandem with their parastatals. They work in tandem with some of the sectoral leaders within the city government. I had, as back as 2010, written a paper which actually talked about mainstreaming climate resilience into urban development planning processes. And there was some of the institutional framework that was suggested that could look at how can we bring in multi-dimensional, multi-sectoral kind of institutional thinking within city governments. What is happening actually is that the problem is that when we talk about cities, we only think about municipal corporations, and they have a very specific role to play. But it's not that. City and city institutions are far beyond municipal corporations. When we say urban local bodies, there are many urban local bodies that become part and parcel of city planning development process, and that has to be looked into while considering this. So smart cities, when it was started, it actually had this particular dream that since it will be driven by a special purpose vehicle, it instituted some of this interdepartmental coordination within the ambit of smart city and how it will be instituted and proceeded further. And I think that is one good example of how we can bring in more thoughts and more kind of collaboration, not only within the cities, but between cities, within the state, and between city and state. So that kind of vertical integration is absolutely important.
Thank you, Divya, for that response. And now I'll take one last question because we are running completely out of time. I would direct that question to Mr. Huberjani. This question says that how do you mitigate barriers to climate finance, such as low credit worthiness of cities and no financial statements? So can you give us some examples from your international experience on this?
Thank you. Well, that's why the backup of the government is important, either at the state level or at the central government level, because when you talk about official development assistance, all those institutions work with sovereign guarantees, and the sovereign guarantee limit is set by the IMF for each country. So the World Bank, Asian Development Bank, the bilateral, the French Development Agency, KfW, European Investment Bank, work within those boundaries set. So it's up then to the central government to say, okay, I'm going to use some of my sovereign guarantee to do some project in those cities that have low creditworthiness and all. Now, the Green Climate Fund doesn't operate with sovereign guarantee. They basically just look at the climate benefit. So if a city with a low creditworthiness or no financial statement is applying, the Green Climate Fund on the public window side, important to notice, will assess this project based on the climate benefit generated by the project, irrespective of the fiduciary situation of the city. They will rely on the accredited entity that has already been pre-screened and accredited with procurement system in order to deliver the funding to those cities. On the private sector window is a bit different. Somebody needs to be on the line in order to justify. If not, those cities just have no chance on the private sector side, or unless you have a philanthrope or somebody who is willing to take the risk. No, okay, this city doesn't have a financial statement, but they are growing fast. There must be something they're doing right. I'm willing to get involved. But all the ODA institution, international finance institution, one of their job is to basically improve creditworthiness of city. So there is a lot of technical assistance money around for any city that want to dig themselves out of the hole with the blessing of the central government to be able to access those funding. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Jenny. And with that, we come to the end of today's discussion on accelerating climate finance under the U20 Manthan discussion episodes. I think climate finance is such a complex, topic that 1 hour is definitely not enough to really cover all the dimensions of it. We could require a couple of days maybe to get every dimension covered. But I hope this 1 hour was, has been able to give you that dipstick kind of a feel where we have touched a few topics around, and, with such amazing people here, I think we've all gotten to know the subject a little better than we had. So with that, I would end today's discussion and appeal to all of you to attend our next U20 Manthan, which will happen next month. Thank you all very much. Have a great day.
Thank you.